having lunch this week with a lady, and I was explaining to her that I was giving this talk today on grief. And she shared with me that she lost her husband when she was 35 years old. And that's tragic. We don't expect to lose our spouse when we're in our 30s. So knowing I was preparing for this, I asked her, I said, what do you recall most about how people showed up in your life during that time? And her answer surprised me. She said, I remember that people would cross the street to avoid talking to me. And it made me really sad. And it really didn't surprise me. So what I want to talk about today is not the person grieving, because we've heard that talk. We know the 5 stages of grief. We understand there's a process. But I want to speak more to the person that shows up next to the person that's grieving. The friend, the coworker, the brother-in-law, and whether your interaction with them is small talk or your interaction with them is you're their advocate and you're going to help them walk through this process. So I'm going to start by defining grief just briefly. Grief is the natural and normal response when we suffer a loss. It's what takes us, I think of it as a bridge. It's what takes us from what was, a loss occurs, and we anticipate what will be. And we have to cross that space in time to get to what will be, and that's what grief is. And when we think about grief, we often think about negative losses. We think of death, we think of divorce, but do we think of things that can trigger grief that are positive losses? Getting married can trigger grief in a positive way for most. It's the mourning of your single life and the anticipation of what married life will look like. Retirement triggers grief. Selling a business can trigger grief. Having a child move out of the home. And so we often associate grief with it being bad, or we want to suppress it. But I think of grief as waving the white flag that says, I have loved, and I have loved deeply, and I have lost what I loved or who I loved. So I think back to my friend who I had lunch with, and this whole notion that people would avoid her when she was grieving. And it made me stop and pause and think, I've probably been that person across the street. Maybe not physically, but metaphorically. And my sense is you've probably been that person as well. And why do we do that? The reason we do it is because it's really simple, I think. We literally have no idea what to say to that person. We want to so badly be helpful, and we have no idea what to say. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. What can you say that's actually helpful? How can you actually show up for this person in their life? And I'll start with the classic, what everybody says. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for your loss. I'm so sorry this is happening to you. I'm so sorry you're going through this. And if we stop and we think about that expression that we say to somebody that's grieving, it's actually just pretty awkward. Because what are they to say back? They'll tell you that it's not a bad thing to say, it's not a hurtful thing to say, but it's not particularly helpful. Because their response back is going to be, thank you. What did we really accomplish in that interaction with that person? And what I think we're trying to express when we say to somebody, I'm so sorry, is we're trying to understand maybe where they are emotionally. And we're anticipating that where they are emotionally is something negative or it's hurtful. So instead of saying, I'm so sorry, what if we just showed up and we said, I can't imagine what this is like for you. Would you like to tell me about it? Or can you tell me what happened? And I hate this one. I hate asking people what happened. And I have to do it in the context of my job all the time. I get the phone call. I'm usually one of the first 5 people that are called when there's a death that occurs. And I don't ask what happened. And the reason I don't want to ask what happened is because I'm afraid that I'm going to remind them of the event. Or I'm going to remind them of their grief. And you can't remind them of their grief because they're living it. They're aware that they're grieving and they're aware that there's a loss. And it's actually helpful to a person that's grieving if you ask them what happened and you ask them to tell you about what's going on in them. Because when people are grieving, they often describe that they're in this alternative state. And they'll describe it as, I'm in a fog, or life feels like it's moving in slow motion. We've heard all of these things said. And by asking them to recount what has occurred and what's going on in their life today, brings them back to reality. It roots them back in reality. which is actually really helpful in the grieving process. Obviously, you have to gauge if they're ready to talk about it or not. But don't be afraid that you're going to remind them of their grief. Encourage the story, is what I take away from that. Encourage them to express their true feelings. It leads me into another thing we often say. I know how you feel. And what that's about is we're trying to create a connection, and particularly if we've had a shared experience. But by telling someone you know how they feel, you're alienating that person. Because what if they don't feel how you felt when you went through that experience? And yet we're making assumptions that we must know how they feel. When I was reading about this one, it reminded me of when my grandfather passed away and I was in middle school. And I wasn't particularly sad when my grandfather passed away, and it's not because I'm a bad person. And my dad kind of called me out on it. He said, why are you crying? Why aren't you more sad? And the reason I wasn't sad is because my grandfather was very sick, and he lived a very full life. And the week leading up to his passing, he told me on multiple occasions he was ready to die. And in his words, he was ready to go be with Jesus. And so when he passed away, I felt relieved for him, and I felt a sense of joy that he was finally where he wanted to be. He was no longer in this state of distress. And yet, on the outside looking in at me, it looked like there was something wrong with me because I'm not more sad, and I was very close to him. So instead of telling somebody, I know how you feel, maybe instead say to them, I too have had a similar situation, and I remember I felt X, Y, and Z, but I'm curious to know how it's different for you. See, it reverses it back to asking them to share their story and share their emotions and not make assumptions that we know where they are. Call me anytime. This is another thing we love to say. Call me anytime. I'm here to help. How can I help? Call me anytime. Do we mean that? Are we going to answer the phone at 3 a.m.? Because grievers, they sometimes don't sleep very well. I think of the new family that has a baby and they haven't slept in 4 days and it's 3 a.m. and they need to talk to someone. And am I going to answer the phone if they call me? No, I'm not. I'm just not, unless they're my sister. So instead of what we're communicating by saying, call me anytime or I'm here to help, is that we want to connect and we want to be helpful. So why not instead connect and be helpful? Tell them, I'll call you Thursday night. And if you don't feel like talking about it, roll a voicemail. If we want to be helpful, instead of saying, let me know how I can help, offer how you can help. Give them 3 options. I'd love to pick the kids up from school on Wednesday for you. Or, I know you have a lot on your plate. Can I bring you dinner on Friday? Or can I mow the lawn this weekend for you? Which of those 3 things would be most helpful to you right now? We oftentimes want to take grievers out of the decision-making seat to be helpful. But in all reality, it's important to leave them in the decision-making seat. It builds back up confidence when we've suffered a loss. But make the decision really small for them. Make it really easy. That's truly how you can be helpful to somebody versus just saying, let me know how I can be helpful. The last example I have for you is the question that we ask all of us. We ask this all the time, but particularly when we ask a griever, how are you? It's usually the first thing out of our mouth. How are you? And if we take a step back and think about what do we really want to know? Because if you ask somebody grieving, how are you, and they feel like a mess inside, they're just going to tell you they're fine. I'm okay, I'm fine, I'm getting by. And that doesn't really give you much to work with. What we need to do as the person coming alongside somebody grieving is normalize for them what they're going through. And so instead of saying, how are you, say to them, I imagine what you're going through is pretty normal, considering the loss that you've incurred. Would you like to tell me how it's been? What's the last week been like? You'll get the information you want. And you'll see the pattern through all of these better questions to ask. What are we doing? We're encouraging their story. We're encouraging them to express their true emotions and feelings. So in all likelihood, you're going to leave here today, and in the next 48 hours, you're going to come across somebody that is grieving something positive or negative. And you won't remember a word I said, because that's how this goes. So if you take away one thing, remember to encourage the story by the questions you're asking. Don't make assumptions that you know where they're at or what they're feeling, but instead make connections and give them space to talk and express themselves. I'll leave you with this. Grief is uncomfortable. And as a society, we don't like discomfort. We don't like to watch people be uncomfortable. We want to help them through it. We want to fix it. You can't fix their grief. You have to sit in the uncomfortable place with them. Show up. And for goodness sakes, please don't cross the street. Thank you.